Okay, so we're going to talk about reflexes. This is chapter 13. And a reflex, we kind of already know what a reflex is. I mean, we know that we have reflexes, which means that something happens. So something causes something to happen, like a pain, or like you could imagine like a thumbtack, stepping on a thumbtack. And then that causes us to respond. Okay, so then we have a response. Now, the thing that separates a reflex from any other kind of response that we might have is we don't really think about it. And so it's very automatic. And in fact, the brain a lot of times doesn't even know that we stepped on a thumbtack until after we've already had our response and we've flailed ourselves around or whatever the response tends to be. It's not a very coordinated response, not really. It's not a very well thought out response is a better way to say. But this mainly happens in the spinal cord. That's where a lot of reflexes take place, and also sometimes in the brain stem. So that would be like a spinal response versus a spinal reflex versus a cranial reflex. So we're going to just talk about those. We're going to talk about how they occur and different types of neural reflexes. Neural reflexes are just those reflexes that require neurons communicating with each other. Okay, so that tends to be how it happens, and it's usually circular, and we'll see that. And then autonomic reflexes, because remember, we have a digestive system, we have blood vessels that have to vasodilate, vasoconstrict, and so a lot of those are also reflexes. The brain isn't really involved in those. It's just the autonomic nervous system that's causing that to take place. And then we'll talk about some specific skeletal muscle reflexes. Okay, so variety of reflexes. We have a lot of different reflexes, but like I said, they all have that one thing in common where there's really no cognitive thought. So we're not actually thinking about what's taking place. So those that are integrated within the spinal cord, and we'll see how that takes place, are called spinal reflexes, as I said. Some within the brain, those are cranial. And sometimes we have different neurons that are involved. So sometimes they're excitatory neurons, and then that may induce a response that is an excitatory response. So when we step on a tack, we may flex a muscle. Okay, so that might be very direct. But sometimes it's an excitatory response, and we may have mixed in there an interneuron that may be inhibitory. So we have that taking place too. Okay, so that might be an inhibitory. So some involve excitatory neurons, some involve inhibitory neurons, and it's all about the effect and what we want to happen. Okay, so like I said, it's called a visceral reflex if it involves organs. Okay, so that's what our viscera is. We tend to be talking about organs when we talk about the viscera. Um, and those are the autonomic nervous system involvement. Remember, we have the sympathetic, which is fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. Okay, so that's the autonomic nervous system, and you should sort of remember that for the rest of your life. Autonomic nervous system means sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. So sometimes we vasoconstrict, sometimes we activate a response in an organ, and sometimes we inhibit a response in an organ. It all depends on what needs to take place. Okay, so then we'll talk about stretch reflexes, which involve muscle spindles, and then we're going to talk about this other thing called the Golgi tendon reflex, which involves tendons. So those are just different sensors, and both involved with muscle contraction, but one is located in the tendon and one is located in the muscle. And then we'll talk specifically how these are integrated to, say, withdraw from pain. Okay, so if we look in general at what happens, so this is a much nicer picture, but it's kind of what I drew earlier. So this is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. What does monosynaptic mean? Well, if you have information, you spill hot coffee on yourself, and it sends a signal saying, ouch, I have pain, and then that may synapse here, this is the synapse, directly with another motor neuron that goes back and says, oh, we need to withdraw, we need to contract that muscle. So since there's only one synapse, we call it monosynaptic. Now sometimes, as I mentioned, we may have some inhibitory neurons, we may have a little bit of communication that actually takes place in the spinal cord. And in this case, we have, so this is the same thing, we may get some kind of a signal, okay, whatever happened here. Then we have a synapse here and another synapse here. Well, that's two synapses. So anything with two or more, we call that a polysynaptic reflex, okay, for obvious reasons. But in general, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about some kind of a stimulus and then a very quick handoff through a synapse to another neuron that causes an effect, okay? All right, so when we talked about the autonomic nervous system or the autonomic reflexes, some kind of a stimulus, whether it's a some kind of an offensive thing that happens in the gut, or the stomach, stretching, filling up with food, whatever, that's our stimulus. And then there's the biggest difference here is that you still have the spinal cord. You have a handoff, so there's a synapse here, another synapse here, but then you have this which communicates with the what we call the autonomic ganglion that sits right outside the spinal cord, and it lines all the way up for all of the spinal nerves all the way up the spinal cord. You have these ganglia, which are just groups of cell bodies, and so you have to have that communication there. And what this tells us is that so in this case we have three synapses, but what that means is all autonomic nervous systems are polysynaptic. Okay, so they're all polysynaptic. Autonomic nervous system, or autonomic reflexes are. Okay, so let's talk about this concept right here, proprioception. If I were to ask you, do you know the position of your foot, or do you know the position of your hand? You do. You can recognize what position your body is in at any one time, and that's what proprioception is. Now, that involves a lot of complex pathways, including the vestibular system. You have to know your balance, you have to know your position in space, that kind of thing. But there are two very important things that are also involved in reflexes. One is called a muscle spindle. We'll see what that is. And the other is called a Golgi tendon organ. So we're going to talk about those. And those are actually measuring how stretched a muscle is, or in the case of the Golgi tendon organ, the tendon that's attached to the muscle. So it's measuring the stretch of the muscle and the tendon respectively in each case. And then we also have receptors that are sitting down in the joints that can also measure the position and keep an eye on the position of those joints. So those are in capsules, ligaments that are around the joints. Okay, so let's first start talking about the muscle spindle. So a spindle is just kind of something that's shaped like this. Okay, so that's what a spindle is. And so we have these sitting inside our muscle fibers, so inside our muscle cells. So if this is a muscle fiber and this is a muscle fiber, these guys, so if you have this muscle, okay, so this is your muscle, scattered throughout this are these little spindles. Okay, so they're kind of scattered throughout the muscle, and they're sort of measuring how stretched the muscle is. Okay, so at any one time, they're sort of sending out, and they're doing this constantly, is sending out a constant signal saying we're fine. So it's sending action potentials at a regular basis. And then as the muscle gets smaller, it sends less of a signal, and then these will adjust. And so these guys are constantly adjusting to the stretch of your muscle. If it's not very stretched, it'll send a slower signal. And if it's more stretched, it'll send a very fast signal. Okay? But then it'll adjust. Once you change the position of your muscle, it'll always go back to normal. Okay? So the reason I mention this is because what happens is you get this fast signal when it's stretched abruptly. Okay, I'm making up new spelling, which is kind of cool. So if it's stretched abruptly, all of a sudden it will kind of panic. Of course, it's just a sensor with some little muscle fibers around it, but it will send out a signal saying, "Oh my goodness, we've just been stretched, and we weren't expecting to be stretched. We're way outside normal." And so what that does is it sends a signal. It says, "Oh, we've been stretched," and it will activate another neuron. And this is the part you really need to understand. And what it does is it goes back and it says, "Oh, we need to tell all the muscle fibers around it to contract." Okay, so we're going to tell them all to contract because our muscle is being stretched against our will and we're going to resist that. That's what you need to understand. Okay, so when the muscle is suddenly stretched, it responds by contracting. And the reason I'm making a big deal about this is when we talk about the Golgi tendon organ, that will actually do the opposite, and we'll see why. Okay, so in a way, this is to protect the muscle, so it doesn't just get stretched and then broken or something like that. It resists that stretching, and it's whatever's causing it to stretch. It will try to fix it. Okay. Sensory neurons, let's see, involves a muscle spindle, which we talked about, and specialized muscle cells that respond to stretch, and that's what these guys are right here. They're all in there testing to see if the muscle is stretched beyond what it was. Remember, it's not looking for an ideal stretch limit. It adjusts as the muscle is stretched or contract. It's constantly adjusting. It's only when it is abruptly stretched and it sends this very fast signal here and says, "Hey, we need to fix this. We need to adjust our muscle." Okay? And I'll tell you right now, one of the places we see that is when we hit our little knee with a hammer in the patellar knee jerk reflex, and it causes the muscle to contract very quickly. It says, "Oh, we're being stretched. We need to contract to resist that, to pull it into place." Okay. So neuron synapse with motor neurons. That's what we see here. Here are these neurons coming out. Okay. These are gamma. Okay, so the gamma neurons are down here, and you don't have to know gamma versus alpha, but there are the neurons, the sensory neurons that are out here, and they will synapse here with motor neurons, and they will go right back to the muscle. It's very simple, monosynaptic in this case, and it will in turn innervate the muscle in which the muscle spindle is embedded, and it will contract. Okay. All right. So I just mentioned the patellar knee tendon reflex, or the knee jerk reflex. And so if we focus on this right here, when you hit the tendon here with a hammer, it will cause the whole muscle to stretch. And when it does, those little muscle spindles will sense that, and they'll send a very quick signal here. And it will send that signal right to this guy, and it will say activate. And when it does that, it will tell this quadricep muscle group, one of the quadriceps, whichever one is affected, they'll probably all be affected, but it will tell it to contract, okay, because we're being stretched and we're not ready to be stretched, so it will tell it to contract, okay. And when it does that, the signal has already gone away, and it will cause the knee to extend out. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This whole idea of a muscle spindle and how those muscle spindles sit down in the muscle, and they're just trying to see if your muscles are being stretched against their will. Now the other thing that I mentioned was the Golgi tendon organ. Okay, so if muscle spindles exist in the muscle, then clearly these exist in the tendon. Now, this is the part that can be confusing. It actually has the opposite effect. When these guys are stretched, they'll actually tell the muscle to relax. Okay? Now why was that? Well, the muscle spindle was trying to protect the muscle when it got stretched abruptly. It's trying to tell it to stop, or to contract, to resist that stretch. And this one is saying, okay, we've got such a load, and this is, try to understand what I'm saying here, we have such a load on the tendon that we are at danger of tearing. we are going to tear if we keep carrying this load. If this load is that's so heavy, it's pulling this away. And so all these little sensory neurons will send a signal back saying, okay, we're really, really activated. This tendon is getting very, very stretched. So what's the best response? Let's shut down the muscle. And whatever we have in our hands, before we tear this tendon, we are going to drop whatever it is that we're carrying. Okay, that's the reflex. You wouldn't have any control over that. So to a small level, when the muscle gets stretched, yes, you want to contract the muscle to resist that, so you can strengthen the muscle and try to make up for whatever it is that's causing it to stretch. But too much stretch to the point that you're damaging the tendon means that you need to just stop the muscle contraction. So this will inhibit it. It's two different things. They're kind of working on the same plane. They're both measuring stretch, but one is contracting the muscle, and the Golgi tendon organ is actually inhibiting the muscle. So if you have, I left out the picture where this guy was carrying something very heavy. He was carrying a box of bricks. This is his hand. So he was carrying all of this stuff and just loading it on and loading it on and loading it on. And then at some point, I don't know how this one's staying there. And then at some point, this Golgi tendon organ said, too much weight, too much weight. We're starting to tear. Okay, the muscle spindle was just measuring the stretch, and it was saying, okay, well, we haven't changed abruptly, so we're fine. It's not sending any signals, or it might be, depending on how much movement there is. But the Golgi tendon organ said, okay, we're so activated right now that this guy is just a heartbeat away from tearing his tendon. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to send a signal back, which is going to synapse here, and it's two synapses, so it's polysynaptic, because there's an inhibitory right there. I just covered everything up. Okay, but there's this little inhibitory interneuron. Okay, so you have inhibition in this case. And it's saying the motor neuron that's telling it to contract, we're shutting it down. And the person then will drop the load, okay, to protect the tendon. Okay, so to protect damage, to protect it pulling away from the bone, whatever. Okay, so remember that there are two different things, both measuring stretch, but one is preventing damage from pulling away from the bone, and the other one is the muscle spindles are trying to keep the muscle from being abruptly stretched to the point that it could also cause damage. So both are there to protect you. They just have opposite effects. Okay, so let's talk in detail about the crossed, or something called the crossed extensor reflex. This is where things get, so we're jumping right into one that's very, very complicated and actually very, very interesting. So let's focus first. This guy stepped on a tack. Okay, guess that's actually number one right there. He stepped on a tack, and that sent a message not to his brain. So if we let's look at how this takes place. This is a signal saying ow, ow, ow. So it sends a signal into the spinal cord, which synapses with a whole lot of other neurons. Now there is one here that's going up to the brain and saying, ow, I stepped on a tack. But before it even reaches the brain, it's already sending out a signal to a whole group of muscles. Okay, several different groups of muscles actually, because look what has to take place. To pull your foot away, you have to contract the hamstring muscles, the muscles in the back part of your thigh. So it has to contract those, so that happens. So we have activation here, contract these muscles. Well, at the same time you're contracting these muscles, you have to inhibit these muscles so they can stretch. So that's what happened here, is you had inhibition of these guys. Okay, that makes sense. That allows you to pull your foot up very, very quickly. Remember, this message is still at this point probably just getting to the brain to be processed. And then at the same time, if you just pull up one of your feet, that's no good because you'll just fall over. So to protect you from doing that, it's at the same time sending a signal here to activate this extensor muscle, saying, hey, we're about to get a huge load. So we're going to tighten this muscle and we're going to inhibit this muscle. And so we're able to take on that load. Okay, so now this leg is going to carry the load. And this all takes place automatically. So when I said it's not very coordinated, that's actually not entirely true. It's not as coordinated as if this signal, if all of these messages were coming from the brain, maybe, but it does protect you. It saves you from just toppling over. And so we see a whole lot of stuff actually. So there's all this stuff, and this is in the gray matter. The gray matter doesn't have myelin because these are a bunch of inner neurons. So it's in the gray matter part of the spinal cord. And all of these signals take place, and you pull your foot up, you put this foot down, and you don't fall over is the idea. And meanwhile, that signal is still going up here to the brain, and you've already saved yourself from this tack, this deadly tack. And then your brain sort of says, oh, ouch. Okay, I stepped on a tack. That's when you actually feel it. So this is all taking place before you even register that you're feeling something. Okay, so just briefly, I just want to mention this very quickly. Most of the time we have conscious control. And so sort of setting these reflexes aside, usually we have this area of the brain called the motor cortex. Okay, and the motor cortex kind of sits up. It's the precentral gyrus, so it kind of goes across your head like you were wearing a tiara or something in the middle. So this is like the front view. So it goes all the way across, left and right. Left controls the right side of your body. Right controls the left side of your body. And these have their individual pathways, and they're very faithful, and they just go to one particular, so this neuron will follow down, and then it will synapse to say your let's say your hamstring, okay, which is the back part of your leg, upper leg. So this one area will be controlling that particular muscle. This one might control your hand. This one might control, I don't know, something else, your neck or something like that. Okay, so we have different areas of this motor cortex that are dedicated, but this is conscious control. This is, we make a decision, we go through this area called the basal ganglia, and we make a conscious decision that we are going to, let's say, take a step. Okay, and so that whole thing, we make the decision in our frontal cortex and we decide we're going to move, and then we send that signal up here and we say, and it's coordinated, I'm oversimplifying, but it's coordinated in this area called the basal ganglia. The signal goes up and it says, okay, these are the muscle groups we're going to move, and then it activates all those muscle groups and they follow their respective pathways down, and then you have, let's say this one, or the quadriceps, and you have a coordinated movement. Now, there is a disease, Parkinson's disease, where a very important region called the substantia nigra is affected. Okay, and so you actually lose the neurons in this region, and it's in the basal ganglia, and it's called the substantia nigra, like I said. And you're actually, this is what this is saying, we're actually losing neurons in our substantia nigra every day. You have less when you go to bed than you had when you woke up, but we lose them at a very slow pace, and it's not until about 80% of them are gone that we actually see the symptoms of this disease, Parkinson's disease. Okay, and then once we've lost a high number of them, like I said, about 80%, then we start seeing abnormal movements, speech, cognitive thought changes, and it just sort of progresses. Okay, so the only difference is, since everybody is losing these all the time, we have an abundance. And Parkinson's, if you get Parkinson's disease, you lose them more quickly. Now, this is a lot of times associated with various drugs or toxins, but some people are just genetically predisposed. So basically what I'm saying is if you live long enough, you will get Parkinson's disease. because you're constantly losing these neurons. And these neurons release dopamine. And so they're dopaminergic neurons that are lost. And so one of the treatments is to give something called L-DOPA, which increases the level of dopamine. Okay, so L-DOPA becomes dopamine. And that's the treatment that takes place. Okay, well that's it. This is hopefully fairly short, but I just wanted to go through all of these and then talk about this Parkinson's disease. So hopefully the reflexes primarily that we covered make a lot of sense.